While Hitler was playing his deadly poker game in Europe, on the other side of the world, another militaristic power was rising. This is the story of how a devastating earthquake transformed Japan into an aggressive empire, and how Nazi Germany built an unsustainable war economy that could only survive through conquest and plunder.
Meanwhile, extraordinary events were happening in the Far East. Japan's drift to war. Japan was among the victors of World War I. Previously, Japan had created a strong economy with the Meiji Restoration, won the First Sino-Japanese War of 1894-1895, occupied Beijing, China's capital, with the great powers in the Boxer War, and then won a tremendous victory in the 1904-1905 Russo-Japanese War. The turning point in the history of Japan, which had won successive victories and was the world's seventh largest economy, was the Great Kanto Earthquake of September 1, 1923, also known as the Great Tokyo Earthquake. This earthquake, with a moment magnitude of 7.9 to 8.2, caused the deaths of approximately 150,000 people, which is more than the casualties caused by the atomic bombs dropped on Hiroshima and Nagasaki in 1945. The social and economic impact of this earthquake was Japan's drift into a racist and militarist trajectory. The massacre of Korean workers working in Tokyo after the earthquake on the grounds that they brought bad luck occurred long before the Nazis began massacring Jews. The Japanese would rebuild Tokyo in a short time after this earthquake, which would reinforce the belief that the Japanese were also a unique nation. The Japanese economy would experience its second shock with the Great Depression. This country was also fundamentally export-oriented. With the closure of export markets, Japan would occupy Manchuria, a province of China rich in mineral deposits, in 1931. When the Kwantung Army, stationed in Korea, Japan's colony, quickly occupied Manchuria, another result would emerge. The Kwantung Army was by far Japan's most powerful land army, and the military leaders of this army would increasingly and dangerously begin to act independently of the chain of command. When the League of Nations condemned Japan's occupation, the Japanese would withdraw from membership. Japanese Prime Minister Tsuyoshi Inukai was aware of the Kwantung Army's unruliness. While trying to remove the generals at the head of the army, he would fall victim to an assassination by a junta formed by some extreme right-wing officers in the Navy and land forces. In Japan, it was no longer parties but military juntas in power. Japan's Emperor Hirohito, also known as Emperor Showa, could not object to the soldiers' partnership in power. Until 1936, the head of power belonged to the Navy faction. The governance of the Japanese admirals was partly moderate and measured. Everything would change on February 26, 1936. It was known that two main factions within the Japanese Land Army were strengthening. This competition would result in a coup attempt. The coup would fail, but Viscount Takahashi Korekiyo, known as Japan's Lord Keynes, the great economist and economy minister of the period, would be killed. Korekiyo had long been the main target for cutting the state budget to prevent the adventures of the Japanese Land Army. The coup had been suppressed, but now the voice of sensible politicians in Japan could not be heard. More importantly, the influence of the more sensible naval officers had also decreased. The famous strategist Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto, who put forward that in modern war, aircraft carriers and naval air forces should constitute the main striking force, had also become a target of the junta members. The Kwantung Army was after a new adventure. With the Marco Polo Bridge incident they created themselves on July 7, 1937, Japan and China entered into a full-scale war. While the Kwantung Army was attacking Beijing, China's capital, starting from Manchuria, the Japanese had landed in Shanghai. The ongoing civil war in China between the communists and central administration had ceased. Chiang Kai-shek and Mao separately began resistance against the Japanese. Especially the Japanese attack on Nanjing in late 1937 would result in a great massacre. The killing of hundreds of thousands of people in Nanjing, China's new capital, had occurred long before the Nazi massacres. The Kwantung Army's eyes were so blinded that Japanese aircraft attacked and sank an American gunboat sailing in the region.
Germany prepares its economy for war. Meanwhile, another turning point had come for Hitler. With the entry of German soldiers into the Rhineland, Austria's fate was now sealed. The Nazis had been influential in Austria for years. Austria was a small country that had inherited the former capital of the Habsburg Empire and German-speaking territories cut and tailored by the Versailles Order. After World War I, some German-speaking regions of Austria, such as the Sudetenland, had been left to Czechoslovakia. Also, both the Treaty of Versailles and the Treaty of Saint-Germain, which dismembered the Habsburg Empire, prohibited the unification of Austria and Germany. Hitler wanted to annex Austria to Germany, making the move that Bismarck had refrained from making in 1866 and 1871. Indeed, Austria would not be able to resist internal and external pressures. One day before the referendum on unification, German soldiers would invade the country bloodlessly. On March 13, 1938, Germany announced it had annexed Austria, the Anschluss Österreichs. Of course, the referendum would be held a month later, but with open voting and under the shadow of German soldiers. The result of the referendum was not surprising. 99.7% voted for Austria's unification with Germany. Germany's acquisition of Austria had brought a few months of relief to the German economy. Germany had been implementing its own unique program since 1933. Nazi Germany, completely contrary to the name National Socialist German Workers' Party in the Nazi Party's name, had tightly controlled workers' rights and unions, rapidly privatizing and transferring many public institutions to the private sector. The Nazis organized the private sector towards the state's fundamental objectives, contrary to the logic of a free market economy, using state-imposed price mechanisms and special incentives. As the German economy rapidly turned toward military production, private sector companies grew rapidly, pursuing very profitable public contracts oriented toward military production. The German private sector had been the Nazis' most profitable partner from the start. Later, during the war prisoners and captured people would also be employed as slave laborers in these massive military production centers. While the Nazis virtually eliminated unemployment by establishing an economic triangle of major public projects, compulsory military service, and armament, private sector companies were becoming giant oligarchical corporations through acquisitions and mergers. As Germany armed to the teeth, the private sector was breaking records in growth rate and profitability in a dazzling manner. Of course, this economic program resulted in an incredible increase in public debt and massive deficits in Germany's always strong balance of payments. The Nazis' support for giant investments to synthetically produce basic raw materials like oil and rubber, which couldn't be produced in Germany, to make the German economy self-sufficient, would further corner the economy. Producing natural raw materials synthetically instead of importing them was very expensive. But this fact couldn't be explained to Hitler and his close team. When the Nazis came to power, they disrupted the existing state structure and created many competing institutions and cliques within the state. All of these were ruthlessly competing with each other to get a share of very limited resources. Spending was crazy, goals were incredible. While Germany spent $452 million USD annually on defense in 1933, this figure had risen to an incredible $7.4 billion USD in 1938. To compare, this figure that Germany spent in 1938 was twice the total defense spending of Britain, France, and the United States. The German Air Force aimed to reach 19,000 warplanes in 1942, but this goal was absurd. For Germany to fly that many aircraft, it would need to possess a very large portion of the world's oil reserves. The idiots in the Navy had produced a mega project called the Z-Plan Fleet, and let alone creating such a large fleet, for this fleet to be able to fight, all of Germany's fuel consumption would need to be allocated to the Navy. The only thing the Nazis understood about economics was plunder. The purpose of the racist Nuremberg laws enacted in 1935 was not to oppress non-Aryan human communities, and especially Jews, but to seize these people's fortunes and assets. While Germany was arming massively during this period, sectors it was trying to polish, like the clothing fashion industry, machinery, and automotive industries, had become unable to find raw materials. The entire German economy by the time we reached 1938 possessed only 1% of the world's gold and hard currency reserves. However, on the same date, the United States, Britain, and France held 76% of reserves. Germany's new military strategy, the concept of lightning war. One of the rare things Hitler did right militarily and instinctively was to create armored units from scratch, influenced by the ideas expressed by a young major in the 1920s. The officer who in the 1920s put forward the idea of using armored units together as a hammer was Heinz Guderian. Guderian had put forward that armored units should be used in independent giant formations supported by air forces, artillery, and infantry. Hitler had found the basic military doctrine for his dream victories. When German tanks entered Austria without fighting in 1938, many of these tanks had broken down on the roads. Hitler spent a large part of his resources in 1938-1939 on repairing his armored divisions, and Guderian's leadership in this matter was very useful.
By 1938, both Germany and Japan had transformed into aggressive militaristic states with economies built for war. Hitler had perfected his concept of blitzkrieg, while Japan's military juntas had set their sights on dominating Asia and the Pacific. But Germany's economic crisis was deepening, and Hitler needed more conquests to keep his war machine running. In the next episode, we'll see how the Sudetenland crisis and the Munich Agreement became the sixth and seventh mistakes of the Western Allies, bringing the world one step closer to total war.